Okay, great. All right, so welcome everyone to the first in-person seminar in the Materials and Manufacturing series in about 2 years. It's great to see a lot of people. I think some of you for the first time in person, which is great. And today we have a very interesting speaker. In a moment, Armagon will introduce her. But we are hybrid today. We are in person and on Zoom, and it's also being recorded as usual. So it'll be on Canvas and it'll be on YouTube. So it's just, as with last week's seminar, this speaker promises to be interactive. So don't be surprised if you get called on, whether you're live or whether your name is showing up on the Zoom list here. So I'm going to turn it over to Armagon, who will be our host for today.
So hello, everyone. Thank you for participating in today's seminar session. We need something. Okay. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Robert Johnson to you. Dr. Johnson received his PhD in Education Administration from Touro University International. He received his Master in Education Administration from the University of Cincinnati and received his Bachelor in Economics from Morehouse College. Also, he received certificate in Applied Neuroscience from MIT Sloan School of Management. In August 2020, he was appointed the 6th president of Western New England University. From 2017 to 2020, he served as a chancellor of University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and from 2010 to 2017, he served as a president of Baker College. Dr. Johnson is a member of the Council on Competitiveness, serving on its National Commission on Innovation and Competitiveness Frontiers. He received on the Executive Committee and as a vice chair of the Massachusetts Business Roundtable, the boards of MGH Institute of Health Professions and the New England Council, the Intentional Endowments Network Steering Committee, and as member of the leadership in the Age of Personalization Consortium. His past service includes the Massachusetts Board of Higher Education, Vice Chair of the Massachusetts Technology Collaborative, and Chair of the Worcester Regional Chamber of Commerce. He co-founded the Massachusetts Digital Game Institute. And in today's presentation, his talking is about the future is now, educating the next generation of entrepreneurs and leaders for the post-pandemic world. It's our pleasure to have you in today's seminar session. You can come and start. Okay.
Thank you so much. So this afternoon. So good afternoon, everybody. Come on, good afternoon. It's so good to see you. You know, you think about this, the opportunity. I'm honored to be the first person to be in person for one of the seminars in more than 2 years. I want this to be interactive. I have some slides that I'm going to go through, talk through, and what have you. I understand I have about 30 to 40 minutes of this presentation. Then, of course, we can open it up for questions and answers afterwards. But if you have a question along the way, feel free to let me know, and we will stop right there. I also want to acknowledge Tim Lowe, who is the Managing Director, Executive Director of Mass Digi right here at WPI, and of course, your Professor Dr. Powell. The title of what I'm going to be discussing is The Future is Now, Educating the Next Generation of Entrepreneurs and Leaders for a Post-Pandemic World. You know, when you think about what you do as engineers, you create something out of nothing. You essentially come up with an idea and you build it. And from that, it can literally transform the world. As I talk today, I'm going to cover 5 topics. One is entrepreneurs leading social progress and prosperity. The second is the context of our time with the pace of change, the future of work and the great reset. And then what does this mean for aspiring entrepreneurs and innovators? And then 3 considerations that I think all entrepreneurs in a post-COVID world should be thinking about. So let me start with the very first, social progress versus prosperity. So what do I mean by that? Social progress versus prosperity. If you think about entrepreneurs, you go back into the early 20th century, you go into the 19th century, they identified a problem, they came up with a solution, and then they figured out a way to commoditize it. What is that? I mean, that's the essence of an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is a problem solver. They come up with a solution, and they find a way to commoditize it, to ultimately make money, at least at least break even, but ideally make a profit. And I very much believe in Adam Smith and laissez-faire and the free hand of the market. It's not a bad thing. So these companies here, I'm going to talk about a couple of them in terms of, they didn't start out saying, how are we going to make a whole bunch of money? They started out trying to figure out how they were going to make a difference. So I'll use Ford as an example, Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford, when he founded Ford Motor Company, I'm from Detroit, by the way, so I tend to use car analogies. I love cars. Henry Ford said, I want to build a car that my employees can afford to buy. In the early 1900s, the average American was making $1 a day. $1 a day. Overall, I think the average income for everybody in the country was about $420 for the year. Okay. Henry Ford came along and said, you know what? With mass production and all of that, paying my employees enough to buy the cars that they're making, because prior to that, it was only for the elite, right? He started paying his employees $5 a day. And when he would build a plant, he would also build houses and neighborhoods around it and created a community. And as a result of advancing social progress for his employees, guess what? Eventually, Henry Ford at one point was one of the wealthiest people in America, okay? But he didn't start off saying, I want to make a bunch of cars to make a lot of money. General Mills. If we go back during the Great Depression, and there were a lot of small food companies, after the stock market crash in 1929, unemployment skyrocketed. You had people who didn't know how they were going to put food on their table. Their dad, who was working in the factory, he didn't know how. Sometimes he wouldn't go home so that his kids would eat, because he didn't want to have to be there, and his kids asking him, how am I going to, why aren't you eating, Dad? Because he didn't want to eat, because he wanted his kids to eat. Mothers not knowing how they were going to feed their kids from day to day. General Mills, and it's a conglomeration of a lot of companies. But if we take the essence of General Mills, some of the things that came out of General Mills is a food product that we use today, Bird's Eye. Right? Frozen foods. The first electric stove came around, was created in 1930. We had Pillsbury to come out of that. Bisquick, baking biscuits, saltine crackers. Okay? Saltine crackers. Let me tell you a story about a brief story about saltine crackers. When we talk about social progress versus prosperity. They had these crackers, and you ever heard the term bottom of the barrel? That's where the worst stuff is. That's because when they would make food, the stuff that was at the bottom of the barrel would spoil. They had no way of keeping it. So you had all these local producers and farmers of food that would create stuff, and it would go on a barrel, and people locally would come about it, come and buy it. But by the time you got to the bottom of the barrel, it was all spoiled. A lot of waste. The way that they made money from saltine crackers, it really wasn't about the crackers. It was about them coming up, going and saying to their scientists, their engineers, I need packaging that I can put these crackers in, so that if I make them here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I can send them down to Washington, D.C. in a truck, and by the time they get there, they won't spoil. And as a result of them doing that with saltine crackers, that little plastic that you still see saltine crackers in today, that was 100 years ago. 100 years ago. But from that, and saltine crackers were really cheap too. Okay, so during the Great Depression, people could buy that kind of stuff. Same thing with chocolate. We could talk about the story of Hershey's and what have you. But the point is, they impacted people's lives with food. And as a result of doing that, they ultimately made a lot of money. Southwest Airlines, Herb Kelleher, he democratized flying. Before Southwest came along, it was only for the elite and the wealthy. And then all of a sudden, he came up with this idea of, he started out in Texas and could only fly in Texas. He started out with this idea of, $29, $39 flights so that the average person could fly. And he democratized, and I'm going to talk about the democratization of businesses and industries and what have you a little later. He democratized flying. Ford democratized driving, owning a car. The point being, and I'm going to close out with this when we get to the end, entrepreneurs, as innovators, don't focus on doing it for the sole purpose of making money, of generating wealth. Do it for the purpose of making social progress and impacting people's lives, and the wealth will be generated in and of itself. Okay. And when you think about all of these entrepreneurs, sure, in the back of their mind, did they want to make a lot of money? Sure. But what did they do at their core? They identified a problem, they came up with a solution, and they commoditized it. Ford, Southwest Airlines, IBM and computers, AT&T, Alexander Graham, it was originally the American Bell Telephone Company. What we now know as AT&T. It opened up communications across the world. Okay. So the point, social progress versus prosperity. I want that to sink in, and I'm taking a little extra time to do that because, man, I wish I was 30 something right now to be, in the world of entrepreneurship and innovation, because there's so much opportunity out in the world. So let's talk about companies that were given birth. People say, oh, we got a pandemic and all of that. Some of the greatest companies and greatest inventions came out of dire times. If we think about companies that were given birth during or right after the last great pandemic, the Spanish flu in 1918 and 1919, and the Great Depression. One of them was Disney, was given birth back then. General Motors was given birth back then. Some of the greatest companies and brands were given birth after the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, World War II, the Great Recession of 2008, and the list goes on and on and on. So even though things may seem dire, when these kind of things happen, it creates all kinds of opportunity. These are old economy, post-recession companies that were given birth. Here are new economy companies, after the Great Recession in 2008. And actually after the recession that took place, I think it was 1999 and 2001, there was a recession. All of these companies were given birth after that. So Tesla, think about this. Tesla, Elon Musk, you have these global companies. And when Tesla was first started, if I had come to you and said, you need to invest in this company called Tesla because they're going to make electric cars. And one day they're going to take over 400,000 orders with $1,000 deposit without a factory in place and no dealer network. And then eventually they're going to end up selling more cars than all of the other companies, all of the other individual companies. You would have laughed at me, right? And that's exactly what Tesla did. He created, and by the way, when Tesla first did that and started taking orders online, the laws were written as such that he was the only company that could do that. So GM, Chrysler, Ford, Toyota, they couldn't do that. They had to go through the dealers to do it. They're doing it now because they got the laws changed. He found a place in the market and he took advantage of it. But what was one of his notions? Yeah, it was part about making money, but it was also about sustainability. He identified a problem. He came up with a solution, and he created a way to commoditize it. So the point is that, you're gonna have economic cycles that go up and that go down. But it's during those times that you create opportunity, that you build stuff. I'll tell you the story of Airbnb before I go on. And this is a true story. So it was 3 roommates sitting up in California, San Francisco. They were having a hard time paying for rent and what have you. And I guess there was a big convention in town, and all of the hotel rooms and everything, they were sold out. And right there in that apartment, they gave birth to the idea of Airbnb. Well, you know what? Let's find Dean Jackson and see if she wants to rent out our house for the weekend. Okay. And then one of them, what's your name, sir?
Alex.
Alex, my son's name, Alex. They went to Alex and said, Alex, can you create an app, if you will, where we can manage this? And that was the birth of Airbnb. But here's the interesting story about Airbnb before COVID, okay? Airbnb rented more rooms than Hilton, and they didn't own any property. Uber provided more rides than any cab company, than all of the cab companies combined, and owned no vehicles. They found a need and they filled it in the most dire of times. As aspiring entrepreneurs and innovators, think about where the hockey puck is going to be, and that's where you want to skate to, not where it is. So in the midst of all of this, the world is changing rapidly. And as entrepreneurs, you have to understand this. As innovators, you have to understand this. The life cycle of products and goods and services, they're not as long as they used to be. So if we think about change, and we think about the first commercial flight that took place in 1900, and for the first 100+ years, it was pretty much a flat curve, okay? But then we saw somewhere in the 2000s where things started, new inventions started coming up faster and faster and faster. Electricity, it took 46 years for electricity to become mainstreamed into society. It took 35 years for the telephone. And we think about this adaption to technology, it literally took generations earlier on. It took 26 years for the television, 16 years for the PC, and just 13 years from when the very first, cellular phone came into existence that it was mainstream or adopted by society. So in 2000, so to speak, the World Wide Web, the internet, and we're right here. So if you look at this, some of the greatest inventions in the 20th century, many of them, 5 or 6 of them, it took generations. It took the father, the grandfather, and the grandkids, to ultimately adopt them. But now things are happening so quickly. The point being is that the pace of change in terms of your new ideas as innovators, as engineers, as entrepreneurs, is in today and it's out tomorrow. It's not like, well, I have a great idea today, Adam, and you create it, and 50 years from now, nobody's not going to come along and replace you. That's not true anymore. It could be 3, 4, 5 years. It could be a decade, but probably not much more than that. So when we think about that last slide, let's put it in a broader context. Life expectancy in 1750 was 37 years of age. By the year 2050, the average person will be living more than 90 years of age, okay? So from 1750 to 1850, it was just under 3 generations, So remember that early slide of 19, of taking 50 or 100 years to adopt one single product? That would be over 3 generations. Okay. And then when we go from 1850 to 1950, about 2.5 generations, people living longer to the age of 69. And now, when we think about lifetimes, it's about 1.5 years in terms of the adoption of these new technologies. One paradigm shift in the 1700 to 1850, 2 paradigm shifts from 1850 to 1950, and at least 5 from 1950 to 2050. New technology, those new ideas that you as entrepreneurs will come up with. This is important for you you say, well, why am I talking about the history? Because if you're gonna leap into the future, you gotta have the context of how the great titans of industry came along. There's an interesting series on television on the History Channel about entrepreneurs that you should watch. It's called The History of Food in America. And it talks about these great titans and how they created competition and innovation and entrepreneurship, from candy bars to the battle between Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Really, really exciting stuff. But the point being, you need to understand this context as you think about going forward. And oh, by the way, as an entrepreneur, as you hire people, you realistically could have 5 generations working for you. Or if you're going to work for a company, you could have 5 generations working within that company. The traditionalists, and yeah, one of them did literally just turn 100 years old today or this year. That's the reality to Generation Z. This becomes important in terms of how you communicate with the people that you will be hiring if you're starting up a business or if you become a manager. You say, well, I don't really need to know that. Well, you're not going to, as an entrepreneur owning a business, you're going to be a one-person shop? I don't think so. You're going to hire people from various generations up and down, but there are 5 currently in the pool. And as you're thinking about this, think about all of these algorithms and things in terms of how they change. Thomas Friedman talks about how anything that we can write an algorithm for, eventually AI will be doing it. A robot will be doing it. I think you all know a little bit something about robots here, just a little bit. I think you know a lot about robots. And I think it's important for you to understand this as you're thinking about becoming an entrepreneur as an innovator. So how is work transforming in the midst of all of this? So we started out with old economy, new economy. We started talking about the context and the pace of change, how rapidly things are changing. And now we're talking about, and then I talked a little bit about, you got 5 generations in the workforce right now. So what does this mean from a career perspective? Even if, say, well, I'm not going to have a career because I'm going to go create my own company. The reality is this, your generation, depending upon which set of data that you look at, will have upwards of 15 to 17 jobs in 5 different industries, and 3 of those industries don't even exist today. Okay, they do not exist today. 15 to 17 jobs, 5 different industries, and 3 of them don't exist. Then even if you're an entrepreneur, if you go back and you look at some of the early stories of how companies got started, what they were then is not what they are now. So can anybody tell me about Foot Locker? What was Foot Locker originally as a company? Does anybody know? Foot Locker originally was the F.W. Woolworths. Yeah, that's right. Look it up. Look it up. It's the same company. It evolved. It evolved. Okay. What was it? Okay, this is an easy one. I know you all know this. What was Amazon when it first got started? Huh? A bookstore, online bookstore. Okay. And it put out all of the storefront bookstores out of business. Is that what Amazon is today? Worth over $1 trillion? They're not doing that selling books, right? The point is you have, I say, 15 to 17 jobs, 5 different industries, 3 of them don't exist. Doesn't matter if you're working for somebody or if you're in business. if you're not evolving and changing, you will become obsolete. So let's talk about these careers. And let's talk about the career arc of the old model, okay? You know, you would go to school from the age of, 5 or 6 until 23, 25 if you go on to get a master's or doctorate or professional degree. Then you will contribute within the job. Then you would ultimately start thinking about retirement somewhere around your mid-50s, because companies had these pension plans and they pay you the rest of your life. And the panic zone was, would I make enough money in my pension, in my retirement plan, so that I could retire when I was 50 or 60 years old? That's what the old model kind of looked like. Okay, and then there's value over time. When we look at this old model, the brain is being developed. You acquire expertise in your 20s and 30s. That's how industry worked in the old days. And then by the time you reach 50-something, you were wise and you could give knowledge to the up and comers. And then the high value zone is really what was between your mid to late 30s to your early 50s. Okay, then we think about this new model, digital natives and the big companies today. These numbers that you see above each of these companies is the average age of their employees. Okay, the average age of their employees. They're known as digital natives. So this is the old high value zone between the ages of the late 30s into the early 50s. Now what we see is that the high value zone is between the late 20s to the early 40s. That's your workforce. That's your workforce. You got to understand that. As an entrepreneur, it's more to being an entrepreneur than coming up with a great invention. It's more to being an entrepreneur and coming up with that great invention. Ultimately, you have to run a business. And in order to run a business, you're going to need people. You got to have people. So you got to understand this. So then we think about the current workforce. Skills demand. Everybody goes to school and tries to acquire skill. How long are you going to live when all is said and done? The current workforce, works primarily between the ages of the late 20s to the mid 50s. These are the new panic zones. How am I going to pay for college? When I'm working, because I'm changing jobs so often, am I going to be able to keep a job to make a decent living? And oh, by the way, because companies aren't providing these pension plans any longer, will I have enough money to retire when I decide I want to retire? We've gone into some of these stores and we see retirees. They're there. They're trying to make ends meet. This is the new reality. So there's a panic zone for the entire life of people. So in the old economy, you go to school, you get a job, you work, and then you retire. It's pretty straightforward. There weren't many shifts. If I go work for IBM today, work there for 20 or 30 years, eventually I retire, I'm going to be fine. And the average lifespan in the old economy was about 75 years old. The new world of work is that you learn, you unlearn, and you relearn as a steady state. You don't retire, you retool and you rebrand. And you might live to become 90 years old. And you're going to be up and down, 15 to 17 jobs, 5 different industries, 3 of them don't exist. So you're not going to work 1 or 2 places and just ride off into the sunset. So what does all of this mean for entrepreneurs? Let's talk about that. What does this mean for entrepreneurs? You adapt or die. Adapt or die. These companies here are no more. Okay. Blockbuster came on the scene in 1985. DVDs, you could rent them and what have you. They thought that they had it. They were doing home delivery and they weren't paying attention. First there was Redbox. Then all of a sudden came Netflix and then digital streaming. When was the last time anybody here went to a Blockbuster's? You. Oh, okay, that's right. They don't exist anymore. They don't exist anymore, right? Okay, let's talk about Sears. Sears, when it first got going, it would put its brand on a lot of different things. Kenmore, that was really a Frigidaire refrigerator, right? But they would put their name brand. So companies would build stuff, they would put it in the Sears store, you would go there and you would buy it. okay? And they were doing well. Pretty much, Sears and Kmart, they were the only game in town across the country. And if you had a product and you wanted to sell it, man, if you could get it into Sears or Kmart, you were set. And then all of a sudden, they got caught flat-footed by Walmart and Target. Okay, big box stores, superstores where you can just go get everything, not just your tools and clothing and that sort of thing, but you can get your groceries and a whole host of other things. And that kind of knocked them out. If you think about a boxing match between Frazier and Ali, they were going to blows, but Sears was still standing. But then Amazon came along, okay? And Amazon said, you know what? Anything you can get from Sears, you can buy it right here and you don't have to leave your house. And that was the death blow. That was the death blow to Sears. Pontiac, Oldsmobile, the Chrysler Plymouth, Mercury. Any of you all decided to buy a car, try to buy any one of those? Well, you can, because they don't exist anymore, okay? And BlackBerry and Kodak, and the list goes on and on and on. Okay, interesting statistic here. So let's look at Detroit. I told you, I'm an auto guy, right? So if you took Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors, they had a revenue of $250 billion in 1990. Had 1.2 million employees combined with a market cap of $26 billion. Fast forward to Google, Facebook, and Apple. $529 billion in revenue, 339 employees with a market cap of $6.8 trillion. Okay, so they have more revenue with fewer employees and more market value. Adapt or die. Adapt or die. Charles Darwin puts it, pretty clear. But here's the interesting statistic. 429 companies that were on the original Fortune 500 in 1955 don't exist today. And that was during a time when to adopt a product, it could take, 20, 30, 40 years. In this market, in today's time, with the pace of change, what do you think that's going to mean for your business? You got to constantly be asking, how do you reinvent yourself? You must adopt rapid innovation. As aspiring entrepreneurs, as innovators, rapid innovation. What's good today will not be good tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after. And if you're not looking at ways to constantly improve yourself, to learn, unlearn, and relearn as an entrepreneur, as an innovator, if you're not looking to learn, unlearn, and relearn as a company, I was talking to the CEO of CVS over at Aetna, and her name is Karen. She said, I'm asking my people to go out there and find the new business that will put us out of business, and let's adopt those business practices. Okay, think about that. That's how the CEOs of today are thinking. And as future entrepreneurs, that's how you have to be thinking. Entrepreneurs are agile, and you must navigate ambiguity as a steady state. If you're looking for, I've started my business, everything is there, everything I need is okay, we have the revenue stream is fine. No, change is going to be the only constant. And it doesn't matter if it was 100 years ago or today. That's pretty consistent. Are you agile? And can you navigate ambiguity in all that you do? Let me get through here because I want to allow time for questions and answers. So the World Economic Forum in last year came up with these 3 steps to entrepreneurship. And I'm going to step through each of them very briefly here. The first one, we could do an entire class on that. When I say entire class for a semester, I mean the history and that sort of thing, the democratization of entrepreneurship and how we have to think about it in that way. We have to be problem solvers. And then lastly, looking at ecological social systems including justice and that posture us to learn or learn, unlearn, and relearn. So let's talk about this first one. And I'll use Amazon as the simple one in contemporary terms of democratization of entrepreneurship. So, what's your name? Kanawan. Yeah. Okay. If she wanted to start a business, if she had a product or something that she wanted to sell, 50 years ago, she would have had to get on the road, go in and out of stores, try and get shelf space, see if Sears or Kmart or somebody would take her product. She'd have to find somebody to manufacture it. Then she'd have to have a warehouse for it. And the list would go on and on and on and on. Now, she comes up with a new idea for a pen. Don't know what it is, but it's a new idea. And you know what? She's able to sell them so fast, right from her house on her website. She doesn't know what to do. She can't keep up with the orders. What can she do? She can go to Amazon on this phone or on that laptop or on that iPad and set up an opportunity for Amazon to market her business. When you go to Amazon and you're ready to buy something, it shows you that there might be 7 different sellers all over the country or perhaps the world, depending upon the product. And if you click and point right there on Amazon, Amazon is selling your product, okay? Which means theoretically, if all of us right now had a real product that we had already taken to market that was doing well, and we were having a distribution problem, and we had a really good business plan, we could go to Amazon, set up things on the Amazon account, and within a month or less, all of us could be selling our products globally, could expose our products to a global market. That is the democratization. That is the democratization of entrepreneurship, okay? Sears did it in a very different way, okay? Walmart and Target did it in a different way, and Amazon has taken it to a totally different level, although Target and Walmart are upping their game in terms of online orders and delivery and that sort of thing. They're pivoting and they're changing. That's important. Systematic challenges versus wealth generators. That's the second point that the World Economic Forum talked about last year. You got to be problem solvers. Remember when I started talking earlier about the importance of social good and then wealth generation? That's what this is all about. This is all about each and every one of you identifying a problem, a real world problem, coming up with a self-sustaining business solution, and then commoditizing it. And then if you do that, all the wealth you ever imagined will be generated. And then lastly, when you think about the World Economic Forum, this is the crux of what they're talking about. As you are an entrepreneur and an innovator, you got to do it with a sense of humanity. How will I make not how will I make more money, how will I make a difference? And if you think about how you will make a difference, you will make more money. And if you do it with a sense of justice in all that you do, sustainability, saving the planet, making the world, leaving it better than the way you found it when all was said and done. And if you have this mindset of learning, unlearning, and relearning as a steady state, that is the ecosystem that you need to become a successful entrepreneur. So I have a simple question. Are you ready? I'm happy to take any questions, comments, thoughts. This is, yes, sir.
One of the slides very briefly, I don't know if we touched on it, but it said that one the adoption of one robot per 1,000 workers leads to unemployment of 6 workers and decreased wages by 50 cents.
Right,
For that average, on average.
right.
One of the things that we also talked about was that anything that's algorithmic or routine
Mhm.
will be done by robots.
Mhm.
And so one of the conclusions that if you kind of just follow that, inevitably that you get to is that a substantial portion of the workforce will be unemployed. If you just follow those 2 points
Mhm.
at a certain point in the near future.
Mhm.
As AI improves
Mhm.
and it becomes easier to do this,
Mhm.
that becomes kind of an inevitability. So you have this old conundrum, which is kind of like with the invention or with the adoption of horses, widespread back in the 1800s, they said, oh, the more people that have horses eventually will be wading through horse poop in the streets, right? That didn't happen because there was a shift and we moved to something else. So in this case, we're seeing unemployment coming in the adoption of robots. Are we going to, or should we expect new industries to pull those workers in, say training robots or maintaining them, right? We expect those industries to develop alongside. How do you balance the fact that we're going to be having this massive unemployment with maybe some adoption of new industries? Is there enough? Do we see that there's enough opportunity there?
My simple answer is absolutely yes. And we've been through this before.
Yeah.
So let me give you an archaic example. In the early 1900s, and I mentioned, the average American was making about $1 a day. There were over 100,000 family farmers. Okay, 100,000 big family farmers. Okay, we're talking about the Monsantos of the world. Okay, big family farms for producing and providing food. But then came along Henry Ford and mass production. Okay, and mass production began to go into the farming industry as well. By the time we got to 1930, 1940, there were only 1,000 large family farms. But all those people who were working on family farms, so to speak, in the early 1900s, were now working in manufacturing plants making more than $1 a day. They were making $5 a day and more with benefits and homes and that sort of thing. We've seen this kind of displacement when new technologies come all the time. The one difference is the pace of change. Remember the slide that I showed you with the generations of how long it would take, 43 years for the electricity to take place, and be adopted. It took the smartphone 13 years. Okay, so whoever was working for Ma Bell, because my mother used to work for Ma Bell, AT&T, as a telephone operator way back when. Those jobs they're going away faster. But you know what? New jobs are coming in faster. So I sit on the Massachusetts Business Roundtable. And every time we meet, there's not an employer who says, I can't find enough people. Okay, so yeah, jobs are going away, but new jobs are being created. And the AI, the technology, the robots complement our skills and enable us to become more creative and do our work better and more efficiently.
So then the follow-up to that is, eventually that statistic that one robot leads to the unemployment of 6 workers, that will decay, given that
that's right.
We'll be creating new opportunities. So then to kind of build off your last point, that we require faster adoption and adaptation to these newer technologies and opportunities. The current education system, at least in the country, below college level especially, is designed for industrial revolution era.
Absolutely.
So it's designed to produce people who can do one thing algorithmically over and over again.
Right.
And so if the education system doesn't pivot, I worry that we don't have people graduating just at the high school level who have the plasticity or the ability to make these big changes as technology shifts. So part of me is worried that we will still end up with a big unemployment problem just because we're not educating the workforce for the work that they will need to do in this, revolutionized economy.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. That's hitting the nail on the head. Our K through 12 system was created for an agrarian economy. That's why school stops in May or June and starts back up in September. Okay, it's the same system. We need to evolve, implode, call it what you may, our K through 12 system. And we literally should think about, what we're doing with our K through 12 system We're trying to retrofit the technology of a Tesla into a Model T Ford, and it's not going to work. It's not going to work. And if we don't figure this out, we're going to fall behind as a society, as a nation, and as a society. And there's some places that are doing it better than others. There was a study done, and I can't remember it right now off the top of my head, back in the 80s and 90s. And it was a longitudinal study that looked at students when they started in the kindergarten, and they tested them to see how many of them or what percentage of them were divergent thinkers, being able to take the Legos, throw them across the table, create something out of nothing. And they followed them all the way through high school. In the kindergarten, 95% of them were divergent thinkers. 95%. By the time they graduated from high school, only 10% were divergent thinkers, speaking to your point. Our school system is making our students think and operate mechanistically, yet the world they're going into is very ambiguous and constantly changing. But what we have learned in the midst of COVID is that mental agility is here. Students have adopted. Now, we will have some challenges for years to come, but it's forcing us now to think about how we do things differently. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So what makes you think that that technological progress will always be inevitable?
That what?
The technological process will always be inevitable. Because I was thinking early for Tesla, right? What Elon Musk tried to do, this is during this time, was in what they call production hell. You know, and he tried to create a fully automated factory, and he just had so many problems. So at some point, he just said, you know what? Let's just go back to the old way. And he had people just making cars the traditional way, like what they do at GM Ford, like by hand. Like people was making it by hand.
Right.
And so that was how he got out of it. So it looks like for, you know, but sometimes, you know, that the technology is not ready. And then sometimes, you know, their history is littered with examples of technologies that people thought were going to, you know, change the world, but then it turns out that it didn't happen. Things don't always happen that way. It's like, what about IBM and Watson, right?
Right, absolutely.
It was supposed to be huge, right? And then
right.
It was sold off for parts.
That's right. So that's a very, very, what's your name? Adjacent. That's a very, very good point. And you're absolutely right. But let's talk about how that works. So I talked about the family farms, right? But between 1905 and about 1925, maybe 1930, there were over 5,000 car companies that came and went. And ultimately, it shook out to 3. Okay? That's part of the evolution of any industry. So you talked about Elon Musk. He had taken some of the stuff or ideas that some of the other car companies had started trying to do with electric cars, but they could never figure out a way to do it on scale. He started going down that road, and he was able to figure it out. Okay, so I think it's an evolution, and we could think about most products. Even I talked about the food industry. Back in the 1920s and 30s, there were over 10,000 small food companies. Okay, you fast forward today, you got General Mills, Kraft's. You got a handful. That's what happens. You have a lot of people trying to figure it out. In the late 1990s, you know, starting up businesses, a website. Well, do you have a website? And the .com boom. You know, so between 1995 and 2000, there were tens of thousands .com companies. By the time you got to 2001, 2002, there were only 3, 4, or 5 that emerged. It's the natural evolution. So it's the thing about adapt or die. If you're trying something that's not working, you better figure out how to pivot and do something different. So I don't think it's necessarily a given, but what history has taught us is that this evolution will happen. The thing that we've never had to deal with before, we've always had to deal with the new technology and people adopting it and companies coming and going. What we've never had to deal with before is the pace of change within a single generation. And I think I saw a hand back here. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, do you want to go first? Go ahead.
Okay. I have a different opinion about starting business in Amazon. So from my knowledge, if we want to start a business in Amazon, we have to spend a lot of money, cost, effort in marketing, and especially in Amazon, it's just a platform, and it's not providing a platform for free. So it's basically like serve as a mosquito, like taking the advantage of the small businesses. You have to like competing with other brands of like suppliers to make your products visible.
Yep.
And Amazon's ask for a lot from that. And normally, if you want to sell shipping containers of goods, you have to prepare 2 shipping containers of goods. One shipping container of goods is used for returning exchange. Because if you don't allow accept the prime policy of Amazon, your products will never be visible in their platform. And the prime policy is basically like not reasonable for sellers. And on the other side, if you don't, the other shipping container of goods, you need to do the marketing, and that would be very hard for small companies or a startup to start business in Amazon. On the other side, if you want to start the business in the traditional way, which is starting a small store like locally, all the local retail system has been destroyed by Amazon.
Oh, absolutely. And Walmart, right?
Yeah.
Walmart moves in and all the mom and pop stores get put out of business. Look, I'm not saying this is easy. Being an entrepreneur is hard.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to market no matter, whether, I used Amazon as an example, but you have to spend marketing dollars somewhere. Where a lot of companies fall short is they don't either know how to create a brand, they don't know how to market. You're going to have distribution issues, whether you're going through Amazon or any place else. You're going to have to warehouse this stuff someplace. You're going to have to have a mechanism to ship it. So all the problems are the same. Okay. I merely use that as an example of one of the things that you can do. For every person who's done it on Amazon, I've seen people, do things and just, get it on the shelf in Walmart. But then you got to fight for shelf space and what have you. I want to go over here. I know we have run out of time.
Okay, I just have one kind of response to one of the questions earlier. When we talk about technologies, like especially like thinking about like Watson that failed, I like to think of those more along the lines of false starts,
Right.
Where those technologies actually were pushing the envelope forward. They just didn't adapt quick enough. Like Watson itself kind of remained pretty stagnant over the years that it existed. But if you look at Siri or any of the other digital assistants now,
Right.
those are fundamentally you can trace their inspirations back to Watson. And same thing's true for MySpace and Facebook. Like, if you look at MySpace is no longer here, it completely fell apart.
Right.
But it was the inspiration and kind of just didn't hit the market
Exactly.
the way that Facebook did. 3D printing is another good example where there have been company after company in 3D printing that have raised tons of money and then disappeared. And it's just, the industry's not ready for it yet.
5,000 car companies and ended up being the big three.
Yeah.
It's the same principle.
So like the progress is inevitable in one way or another. It just, you have to find the time, the place, the niche, and the right regulations to get it to work.
All right, I want to thank you all for coming. One of the downsides of being in a classroom is that we have to end at about 10 minutes of. So let's thank our speaker. I hope more of you who are on Zoom will be able to join us in person next time. So thanks very much. All right. See you next week.